The year is 1521. The air in the city of Worms is thick with the smell of wood smoke, damp wool, and the nervous sweat of a massive, waiting crowd. They are packed into the narrow streets, a sea of faces turned towards the bishop's palace, a fortress of stone and power. Inside, the atmosphere is even heavier. The heat of 1,000 candles mixes with the chill of impending doom. A lone man walks through the grand hall. The click of his boots on the cold stone floor echoes like a ticking clock. He is not a soldier, not a prince. He is a monk, clad in a simple black habit. His name is Martin Luther, and he is walking towards his own funeral. He is led into the main chamber. The space is cavernous, a testament to imperial might. Torchlight flickers, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the vaulted ceilings. And there, on a raised dais, surrounded by the glittering, jeweled nobility of the Holy Roman Empire, sits the most powerful man in the known world, Emperor Charles V. He is young, only 21, but his face is a mask of rigid authority. His eyes, heavy-lidded and dark, fix on the approaching figure. He does not see a man of God. He sees a problem, a single, stubborn voice threatening to tear his empire, and all of Christendom, in two. On a table beside him rests a stack of books and pamphlets, Luther's writings. They are the evidence. The charge is heresy. The chamber falls silent. The only sound is the crackle of flame and the ragged breath of the hundreds of onlookers. An official steps forward. His voice cuts through the tension, sharp and clear. He gestures to the pile of texts. "Martin Luther," he demands, "are these your writings?" Luther's voice, when it comes, is quieter than expected, but it carries. "Yes." The official continues. "And will you now, before this assembly, recant the heresies and errors contained within them?" Every eye is on the monk. He knows the rules of this game. To recant is to live. To refuse is to be condemned as an outlaw, a man whom anyone could kill without consequence. He had been promised a debate, a hearing. This is not it. This is an ultimatum. He looks from the stern face of the official to the impassive, imperial gaze of Charles V. The future of Western civilization holds its breath, waiting for his reply. He takes a breath. "Since your majesty and your lordships desire a simple reply," he says, his voice gaining strength, "I will answer without horns and without teeth." The old German proverb hangs in the air. He will be direct. "Unless I am convinced by the testimony of the scriptures or by clear reason," he declares, his words beginning to ring off the stone walls, "for I do not trust either in the Pope or in councils alone, since it is well known that they have often erred and contradicted themselves. I am bound by the scriptures I have quoted, and my conscience is captive to the word of God." He straightens his shoulders, a gesture of defiance that seems to suck the air from the room. "I cannot and I will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither right nor safe." He pauses, letting the weight of his rebellion settle on the shoulders of every prince, every bishop, every power broker in the room. Then, he delivers the final, unforgettable line, the one that will echo through history. "Here I stand. I can do no other. God help me. Amen." The silence that follows is louder than any thunder. It is broken by the sharp, frustrated command of the emperor. Luther is ushered out. The door to the chamber booms shut. The confrontation is over. But the war has just begun. To understand the earthquake that just shook this hall in Worms, we must rewind. We must travel back to a world where a single, unified church was the bedrock of reality. It was the air people breathed, the water they drank. To question it was not just treason, it was insanity. Our two protagonists could not be more different. Charles V, a name that sounds like an empire itself. By the grace of God, Holy Roman Emperor, Archduke of Austria, Lord of the Netherlands, King of Spain, and ruler of vast New World territories. His inheritance was a sprawling, patchwork quilt of lands, languages, and loyalties, stitched together only by his person and the universal authority of the Catholic Church. He was a living institution. Pale, with a jutting jaw that spoke of Habsburg determination, he saw himself as God's temporal sword on earth. His life's mission, to defend the faith and preserve the unity of his domains against the Ottoman Turks to the east, the scheming King of France to the west, and now, this new, insidious threat from within. And then, from the misty forests of Saxony, came the voice. Martin Luther, a miner's son, a tormented soul. He was not a rebel by nature. He was a man desperately seeking a God of mercy, not of wrath. The church he knew was one of rituals and transactions. Salvation, it seemed, could be purchased. The smell of incense in grand cathedrals often masked the stench of corruption. The clink of coins in indulgence boxes, payments to shorten one's time in purgatory, echoed louder than prayers. We see him in his monastic cell, a cramped, cold room. The scent of old parchment and candle wax. The sound of his pen scratching, day and night. He is not plotting a revolution. He is wrestling with his own soul, terrified of damnation. His breakthrough was as simple as it was explosive. He found, in the letters of St. Paul, a radical idea: the just shall live by faith. Not by rituals, not by payments, not by good works, but by faith alone. God's grace was a free gift, not a commodity to be bought. This spiritual crisis collided with a worldly scandal. A papal indulgence salesman named Johann Tetzel was touring Germany with all the flair of a carnival barker. When the coin in the coffer rings, he chanted, the soul from purgatory springs. The vulgarity of it sickened Luther. It turned God's grace into a cheap magic trick. So, on October 31st, 1517, he did what any earnest academic would do. He drafted a list of arguments, 95 theses, debating the power and efficacy of indulgences. He may have nailed them to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, the university bulletin board. The sound of that hammer strike was not loud, but its reverberations would topple thrones. The theses were not a declaration of war. They were an invitation to a debate. But the invention of the printing press turned his academic query into a viral wildfire. Pamphlets, printed in the common German tongue, spread his words from town to town, tavern to tavern. They were read aloud in town squares. For the first time, the common people were hearing a language of faith that was personal, direct, and free from the corrupt intermediaries in Rome. In Rome, Pope Leo X initially dismissed it as a drunken German squabble. He was a Medici, a patron of art, a man more concerned with building St. Peter's Basilica than with theological disputes in a backwater province. But as the fire spread, his dismissals turned to threats. Luther was summoned, ordered to recant. Each time, he refused, his defiance growing in direct proportion to the pressure applied. And watching it all, from his throne in Spain, was the young emperor, Charles V. He had his own problems. The Ottoman Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, was hammering at the gates of Vienna. The King of France, Francis I, was challenging his Italian possessions. The last thing he needed was a religious schism tearing his German lands apart. He wanted the Luther affair to go away. Quietly, quickly, he summoned the German monk to the Diet of Worms, promising him safe passage. It was to be a hearing, a chance for Luther to explain himself before the assembled princes. But when Luther arrived, he found not a forum for debate, but a tribunal. The books were piled high. The question was simple: recant or else. The stage was set. The monk and the emperor. Faith and power. Conscience and command. And in that silent, suffocating moment after Luther's "Here I stand," everyone in that room knew. There would be no going back. The world had just cracked open. The echo of Luther's "Here I stand" did not fade. It hung in the bishop's palace like gunpowder smoke after a volley. For a long moment, no one moved. The princes and bishops stared, some in horror, some in secret admiration. The young emperor, Charles V, remained an unreadable statue, but a faint tremor in his hand, hidden in the folds of his rich robes, betrayed the seismic shock that had just occurred. Luther was ushered from the chamber, his footsteps echoing again, this time retreating. The heavy oak door boomed shut, a sound of finality. Inside, chaos erupted. Angry shouts in German, Latin, and French clashed in the air. The imperial diet was fractured. Some princes, loyal to Rome and the emperor, demanded immediate condemnation. Others, long resentful of Rome's financial and political power, saw in Luther's defiance a weapon they could use. Charles V waited for the uproar to subside. When he spoke, his voice was cold, flat, and dripping with imperial certainty. A single friar who goes against the faith of all Christendom must be wrong. He looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over the German nobles whose loyalty was now in question. I am resolved to stake upon this cause my kingdoms, my friends, my body and blood, my life and soul. The verdict was inevitable. Weeks later, the Edict of Worms was proclaimed. Martin Luther was declared a heretic and an outlaw. The sentence was stark. We want him to be apprehended and punished as a notorious heretic. It also became a crime for anyone to give him food, shelter, or aid. His writings were to be burned. His very ideas were deemed contagion. The emperor had thrown the full weight of his throne against one man. But the man was already gone. As Luther journeyed back to Wittenberg, the world outside his carriage window had changed. He was no longer just a theologian, he was a symbol. His safe conduct from the emperor would soon expire, leaving him a hunted animal. The woods that lined the road were no longer just woods. They were a place of shadows and potential ambush. Every hoofbeat sounded like pursuit. Then, on a lonely stretch of road through the Thuringian forest, it happened. The carriage was halted by a group of masked horsemen. They were rough, efficient. They dragged a protesting Luther from his seat. His companions, part of the prearranged plan, put on a convincing show of terror. Luther was thrown onto a horse, and the party vanished deep into the trees. To the world, Martin Luther had disappeared. Kidnapped. Likely dead. The news spread like a plague. In Worms, Charles V might have allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The problem had been solved. The heretic was silenced. But in the taverns and market squares of Germany, a different story was brewing. Whispers of imperial treachery, of a broken safe conduct, began to circulate. Luther's supporters cried murder. His image began to transform from a stubborn monk into a martyr. Meanwhile, in a secluded, drafty castle atop a rugged hill, the Wartburg, Luther was very much alive. The kidnapping had been staged by his own protector, Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony. He was now Junker Georg, Knight George, his monk's tonsure growing out, his black habit replaced with the clothes of a minor noble. The castle was cold, the food was plain, and he was plagued by crippling loneliness and bouts of deep depression he called his Anfechtungen, spiritual attacks. He was tormented by constipation and insomnia. The silence of the fortress was a stark contrast to the roaring fame he now possessed. It was in this isolation, this forced retreat from the world he had set ablaze, that Luther committed his most revolutionary act. It was not a defiant stand before an emperor. It was a quiet, painstaking act of translation. He procured a Greek New Testament and began the work of rendering it into a powerful, vibrant German that the common plowboy could understand. The sound of his pen was the only weapon he had left. He was not just translating words. He was forging a new identity for a people, giving them God's word in their own tongue, bypassing the priests and the Pope entirely. The book would become a bomb, more powerful than any edict from Worms. Back in the world, the emperor's edict proved impossible to enforce. Printers worked day and night, their presses churning out Luther's pamphlets and his nascent German Bible. The words "Here I stand" were printed and reprinted, becoming a rallying cry. The Reformation was no longer an argument, it was a movement. It was finding its way into the hands of knights, merchants, and peasants, who saw in it not just spiritual solace, but a justification for their own long-held grievances against the oppressive social order. Charles V, however, could not focus on this German sickness. Greater threats demanded his attention. His empire was under assault from all sides. The Ottoman war machine, a vast force of Janissaries and Sipahi cavalry, was a clear and present danger, a physical siege against Christendom. His rivalry with King Francis I of France erupted into open warfare, a clash of dynastic egos fought on the battlefields of Italy. The Habsburg-Valois wars drained his treasury and his attention. For years, the Lutheran problem festered. It was a fire he didn't have the time or resources to put out. He issued decrees from distant battlefields, but they were just words on paper, lost in the wind. The German princes, sensing the emperor's distraction, grew bolder. They formed alliances, they debated Luther's ideas, and some, like the powerful Philip of Hesse, openly converted. The political map of Germany was being redrawn, not by treaties, but by theology. The movement Luther ignited began to spiral beyond his control. It was no longer just about faith and grace. It became about power. In 1525, the German Peasants' War erupted, a bloody, brutal class war. The peasants, inspired and emboldened by Luther's idea of a priesthood of all believers, rose up against their feudal lords, demanding an end to serfdom and unjust taxes. They quoted Luther to justify their rebellion. Luther was horrified. He had championed spiritual freedom, not social revolution. In a vicious pamphlet against the murderous, thieving hordes of peasants, he urged the princes to smite, strangle, and stab the rebels. The nobility did exactly that, slaughtering over 100,000 peasants with a brutality that shocked Europe. The man of conscience had shown a terrifying, authoritarian side. The Reformation's pure, spiritual fire was now mixed with the smell of blood and smoke. The chaos was exactly what Charles V had feared. The heresy was not just infecting the church, it was tearing the very fabric of society apart. The emperor, victorious against his foreign foes, now knew he had to turn his gaze back home. The time for edicts was over. The time for war was coming. The smell of gunpowder and blood from the peasants' war slowly dissipated, replaced by the scent of fresh ink and political intrigue. The rebellion had been crushed, but the ideas that fueled it were now embedded in the German soil. Martin Luther, no longer the outlaw Junker Jorg, was a settled, married professor in Wittenberg. His home was filled with the sounds of his children and the constant scratching of his pen. But the world outside his door was hardening, crystallizing. The movement he started was no longer a protest. It was becoming a new church, with its own doctrines, its own politics, its own name, Protestantism. Charles V, meanwhile, had finally achieved a moment of respite. In 1527, his mutinous army had sacked Rome itself, a shocking act of violence that humbled the papacy and left Pope Clement VII a virtual prisoner. Then, in 1529, he finally defeated his arch-rival, Francis I of France. For the first time in over a decade, the emperor could draw a breath and look inward. The Lutheran heresy was no longer a distant nuisance. It was a cancer at the heart of his empire, and he was now free to operate. He summoned another imperial diet, this time in the city of Speyer. His command was simple and absolute. The Edict of Worms must be enforced. The heresy must be eradicated. But when the decree was read aloud, a moment of historic defiance occurred. A group of German princes and representatives of free cities stood in protest. They protested that in matters of faith and conscience, the emperor could not overrule them. From this act of defiance, a new label was born: Protestants. The air in the hall was electric. This was no longer one monk against an emperor. This was a political bloc, armed and powerful, standing against imperial authority. The protest at Speyer was a declaration of political war. Charles V, a man who believed his power was divinely ordained to maintain unity, saw this not just as rebellion, but as a personal and cosmic betrayal. He would give them one last chance, one final opportunity for reconciliation before the sword would decide. He called for a diet in the city of Augsburg in 1530. His tone was conciliatory, but the threat was unmistakable. He demanded the Protestants present a clear statement of their beliefs. He would attend this diet in person for the first time in a decade, a sign of its immense importance. The very fate of a unified Christendom would be decided not in Rome, but in a German city hall. The stage was set for the ultimate theological showdown. Luther, still an outlaw under the Edict of Worms, could not attend. The task of defending the new faith fell to his brilliant, younger colleague, Philip Melanchthon. A scholar, not a fighter, Melanchthon saw this as a final, desperate chance for peace. He labored over a document meant to bridge the divide, to show the emperor that their faith was not a heresy, but a purification of the ancient, true church. This document would become the Augsburg Confession. The city of Augsburg swelled with tension. The emperor arrived with immense pomp, his Spanish and Italian troops a visible display of his power. The Protestant princes arrived with their own retinues, their backs straight with conviction and fear. The streets were a cacophony of different languages, the clatter of armor, and the whispered prayers of a populace holding its breath. On June 25, 1530, in the crowded, sweltering chapel of the bishop's palace, the confession was read aloud. Melanchthon's Latin text was clear, moderate, and scriptural. It was a plea for understanding. 4 hours, the voice of the reader filled the silent room, outlining the Protestant beliefs on justification by faith, the nature of the sacraments, the abuses they sought to reform. Charles V listened, his face an inscrutable mask. He did not understand German, and his Latin was poor. He relied on advisors who whispered translations and condemnations in his ear. When the reading was finished, he did not engage in debate. He did not ask questions. He simply had a Catholic theologian, Johann Eck, prepare a brutal, point-by-point refutation. The confession, in the emperor's eyes, had been soundly defeated. He gave the Protestants until April of the next year to return to the Catholic fold. The decree was a death sentence. The Protestant princes knew it. Reconciliation was impossible. The emperor's patience and his power were now poised to strike. As they left Augsburg under a cloud of failure, they knew what they had to do. If their faith could not be defended with words, it would have to be defended with steel. Later that year, in the small town of Schmalkalden, nestled in the dark, forested hills of Thuringia, a secret meeting took place. The atmosphere was grim, the discussions hushed. The leading Protestant princes, John of Saxony, Philip of Hesse, and others, gathered not for a debate, but for an alliance. They formed the Schmalkaldic League, a defensive military pact. They pooled their resources, their armies, their resolve. They were no longer just a religious movement. They were a state within a state, a rival power bloc prepared for a war of survival. For over a decade, a tense, armed peace held. The Schmalkaldic League grew in strength, adding new members, its armies drilling in fields across northern Germany. Charles V was distracted again, this time by a renewed Ottoman threat and a bloody campaign in North Africa. He was playing a game of chess on multiple boards, and the German princes were just one piece. But the emperor never forgot. The defiance at Augsburg festered in his soul. The League was a challenge to his God-given authority that he could never, ever abide. He watched, and he waited. He bided his time, playing the princes against one another, exploiting their theological squabbles and personal rivalries. He was like a spider at the center of a web, feeling for the right moment to ensnare his prey. That moment finally came in 1546. The Ottoman threat had receded. He had made a temporary peace with France. His treasury was, for once, flush with New World silver. And then, the spark, Martin Luther, the architect of all this chaos, finally died of natural causes. The one figure who could unite the Protestant factions was gone. The movement was leaderless, vulnerable. Charles V saw his opening. He had spent 15 years preparing for this. He had alliances with some German princes, the unwavering support of the papacy, and the finest professional army in Europe, battle-hardened in Italy and the Mediterranean. The time for diets and decrees was over. The time for the sword had come. The emperor, now a middle-aged man plagued by gout and responsibility, but burning with a cold, relentless purpose, gave the order. The imperial armies began to march north. The Schmalkaldic War had begun. The war began not with a grand battle, but with the quiet, chilling sounds of preparation. The rhythmic clang of the armorer's hammer in Innsbruck, the lowing of oxen pulling cannon over alpine passes, the muttered prayers of Spanish tercios, hardened veterans who viewed the German heretics with pious contempt. Emperor Charles V, his body racked by gout but his will forged of imperial steel, was finally on the march. His target was the heart of the rebellion, the Saxon city of Wittenberg, Luther's own home. The Protestant Schmalkaldic League had the numbers, the resources, and the home ground. But they were divided, their princes squabbling over strategy and theology, their resolve softened by years of uneasy peace. They moved with the sluggishness of a committee, while Charles moved with the singular focus of a predator. The two armies finally clashed on a cold, damp morning on April 24, 1547, near the village of Mulberg. The river Elbe flowed, grey and sluggish, through the misty fields. The Protestant army, led by Elector John Frederick of Saxony, was caught by surprise, its scouting parties having failed in the pre-dawn gloom. They scrambled to form ranks, the mud sucking at their boots. From a vantage point, Charles V watched, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. He had orchestrated this perfectly. He turned to the Duke of Alba, his most ruthless and capable general. "I came, I saw, God conquered," he would later say, echoing Caesar but attributing his victory to a higher power. The order was given. The imperial cavalry, a wave of steel and horseflesh, swept across a hidden ford in the river. They hit the Protestant flank like a thunderclap. The sound was horrific, the scream of horses, the crunch of splintering pikes, the desperate shouts of men being cut down. The Protestant lines wavered, then broke. It was not a battle, it was a rout. Elector John Frederick, a mountain of a man, fought with desperate bravery, his face a bloody mask from a deep gash across his nose and cheek. But it was futile. He was surrounded, captured, and dragged before the emperor. Charles V looked down at his defeated foe, the man who had dared to defy him at Augsburg. The sentence was swift and brutal. John Frederick was sentenced to death. The price of rebellion would be paid in blood. In the end, the emperor commuted the sentence, but only after the elector signed the capitulation of Wittenberg, stripping him of his title and vast lands. It was a humiliation designed to break the spirit of the entire movement. Charles V then marched in triumph into Wittenberg. The city where it all began was now his. He walked through the streets, past silent, terrified citizens, and entered the castle church. He stood before the very door where Luther had nailed his 95 Theses 30 years prior. He gave a single, silent order. Luther's grave was to be left undisturbed, a rare moment of posthumous respect, or perhaps a calculated gesture to avoid creating a martyr shrine. But the message was clear. The emperor was master here. The Reformation, it seemed, was over, smothered in its cradle by the iron fist of imperial might. Charles V had achieved his life's ambition. He had crushed the political and military power of the Protestant princes. The Schmalkaldic League was shattered, its leaders imprisoned or submissive. He summoned another diet at Augsburg in 1548, and this time there was no protest, no defiance. He imposed his will, a religious settlement known as the Augsburg Interim. It was a forced compromise, allowing some Protestant practices like married clergy, but demanding a return to Catholic doctrine and authority. It was a peace dictated by the point of a sword. But a peace built on force is a fragile thing. The smell of ash and defeat in Mulberg did not extinguish the fire of conviction. It only drove it underground. In town squares across Germany, the imperial decrees were read aloud to sullen, silent crowds. The words of the emperor were law, but they were not believed. In hidden rooms, Protestant pastors continued to preach. In secret printing presses, pamphlets continued to roll off, denouncing the interim as the interim of hell. The emperor's victory was an illusion. He had won the war, but he was losing the peace. The very ruthlessness of his triumph bred deep, lasting resentment. The German princes, even the Catholic ones, watched in alarm as Charles centralized power, placing his own family in key positions. The man who had fought for unity was now seen as a foreign tyrant, a Spaniard intent on subjugating Germany. Then, from the most unlikely of places, a new rebellion sparked. The Protestant cause, seemingly dead, found a new champion in the very family Charles had installed to rule Saxony, the ambitious and wily Maurice of Saxony. Motivated by a complex mix of personal ambition, political calculation, and perhaps a flicker of genuine belief, Maurice secretly allied with the new King of France, Henry II. In a stunning act of betrayal, he turned his army against the emperor. In 1552, Charles V, now ill, aging, and disillusioned, was caught completely by surprise. Maurice's forces swept across the south, forcing the emperor to flee from Innsbruck in the dead of night, carried over the Alps in a litter through a blizzard, a humiliating escape that broke his health and his spirit. The power he had spent a lifetime building evaporated in a matter of weeks. The war-weary sides finally met at the negotiating table. The result was the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. Its central principle was Quis regio, ius religio, whose realm, his religion. It was a pragmatic, brutal solution. The faith of the ruler would dictate the faith of his subjects. Lutheranism was now a legally recognized religion in the Holy Roman Empire. The unity of Western Christendom was officially, permanently shattered. Charles V's life's work was in ruins. The heretic he had stood against at Worms had, in the end, prevailed. The empire he had struggled to hold together was now a fractured collection of Catholic and Lutheran states. The constant war, the gout, the crippling depression, it had all been for nothing. 2 years later, a broken man, he would do something unprecedented for a man of his power. He would simply quit. He abdicated his thrones, dividing his vast empire between his brother and his son, and retired to a remote monastery in Spain. He spent his final years in a small, sparsely furnished room, surrounded by clocks, trying to synchronize them, a futile attempt to bring order to a world that had spiraled completely beyond his control.